The bank was quiet that afternoon, just the dull hum of ceiling fans and the shuffling of papers. An elderly man, dressed in a worn jacket with faded military patches, stepped up to the counter. His hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from age and memories too heavy to forget. He handed over a check, his pension, hard-earned after years of service. But instead of respect, he was met with suspicion. The young teller narrowed her eyes, holding the check up to the light. "This looks fake," she said coldly, loud enough for others in line to hear. Murmurs spread. Customers glanced, some whispering, some smirking. The old veteran's face flushed, but he stood tall, his jaw set. He had endured worse than humiliation. "Sir, I think this is fraud," the teller snapped. She picked up the phone, calling her manager. Within moments, security was alerted. The veteran didn't argue, he only sighed, a quiet sound of disappointment. But just minutes later, the bank doors burst open. Four black FBI cars screeched to a stop outside. Agents rushed in, their eyes fixed not on the veteran, but on the teller. And that's when the truth shattered the room. The glass doors of the bank rattled as 4 FBI cars screeched to a halt outside. Tires burned against the pavement, and within seconds, sharp black-suited agents stormed in, their jackets marked with bold yellow letters. The sound of boots echoed across the marble floor as every customer froze mid-breath. The bank teller, who had been so loud and confident just seconds earlier, suddenly paled. Her fingers slipped from the phone receiver as her eyes darted to the veteran, expecting him to be handcuffed. But the agents didn't even look at him. Instead, they moved past him with brisk precision, their eyes locked on the counter where the teller stood. The veteran's posture remained calm, though his heart beat heavily. He wasn't new to tension. He had walked battlefields where silence before a storm meant life or death. Compared to that, this was just noise. Yet still, humiliation stung. One agent stepped forward, his voice stern but controlled. "Are you the one who called in a fraudulent check?" The teller stammered, trying to compose herself. Yes, sir. I believe this man is attempting fraud." She pointed directly at the old veteran, who stood silently with his worn cap in his hands. The agent turned slowly. His eyes scanned the veteran, lingering on the military patches, the weathered skin, the posture that, even in old age, spoke of discipline and dignity. And then something happened. The agent's face softened. Recognition flickered. "Sir," the agent said, addressing the veteran. His voice changed, no longer professional protocol, but something personal. Something respectful. "Could you confirm your name for me?" The veteran's voice was quiet, steady. "Sergeant Major Robert Hayes. United States Army. Retired." The name rippled through the air like a dropped stone into water. A few customers shifted uneasily. The teller blinked, suddenly unsure of herself. But the agent's expression told the truth. He knew the name, because that name was more than just a name. It was history. It was sacrifice. It was courage etched into the records of real war heroes. Agent Collins, the one leading the team, straightened his shoulders. "Sergeant Major Hayes," he repeated, with the weight of respect. "It's an honor, sir." The teller's mouth fell open. She glanced around, desperate for someone to back her up, but the silence of the room betrayed her. For the first time since she accused him, she realized she wasn't standing against an old man. She was standing against a legacy. But the FBI wasn't finished. "Sir, may I see the check?" Agent Collins asked politely. The veteran handed it over without a word. Collins examined it, nodded, and then looked back at the teller. His voice hardened like steel. "This is legitimate. Government issued. A pension earned through service and sacrifice." The teller swallowed hard, but Collins continued. "And you should know, this man isn't just a veteran. He's a decorated war hero. A forgotten hero, maybe, because too many people today don't remember the price of freedom. But Sergeant Major Hayes is the kind of man this country owes more than it could ever repay." Gasps swept the room. Customers who had sneered or whispered earlier now lowered their heads, shame burning on their faces. The veteran stood motionless, his dignity intact, though his eyes glistened faintly. Not from weakness, but from the weight of being recognized after years of silence. One elderly woman in the line whispered, "Hayes? The one from Fallujah? The one who saved that convoy?" Agent Collins nodded gravely. "The very same." The teller's knees weakened. She had accused a man who had bled for the flag she claimed to respect. She had humiliated someone whose battlefield courage had saved dozens of young soldiers, whose soldier sacrifice had earned him medals she didn't even know existed. Collins turned back to Hayes. "Sir, forgive the interruption. We were tracking a separate case when we heard your name come over the line. It was unexpected, but we couldn't stand by while your honor was questioned." Hayes gave a small nod. His voice, though soft, carried strength. "Son, I faced worse than a false accusation. What matters is that the truth stands. Always." The bank was silent again, but this time it wasn't tension, it was respect. Customers stood straighter. A few even clapped softly before stopping, realizing this wasn't a stage, it was real life. The teller, trembling now, whispered, I didn't know." Hayes finally turned to her. His words weren't angry. They weren't bitter. They were steady, calm, like a man who had already carried too much to waste his breath on hate. "You didn't have to know my name," he said quietly. "You just had to treat me like a man. Like any other American who walks into this bank." Those words cut deeper than any rebuke. The teller's face flushed with shame, her arrogance stripped away. Collins placed the check gently back into Hayes's hands. "Sir, you've given this country enough. Don't let moments like this weigh on you. There are still people who remember. People who honor men like you." Hayes nodded again, but inside, his mind drifted back to years on the battlefield. The faces of soldiers who hadn't come home, the sound of gunfire, the weight of sacrifice. Those men would never stand in a bank line. They would never have their names called out in honor. They were the real forgotten heroes. And Hayes knew, more than anything, that he carried their memory with him every single day. As the FBI agents stood in the middle of the bank, the scene shifted. The customers' stares were no longer suspicious, they were reverent. Some lowered their eyes in silent respect. Others straightened their backs, almost instinctively, as if standing at attention. The room had transformed from a place of humiliation to a place of tribute, and it was all because truth had broken through ignorance. For Sergeant Major Hayes, it wasn't about the recognition. It wasn't about the dramatic entrance of federal agents. It was about a reminder that honor, though sometimes forgotten, still lived in the hearts of a few. And that sometimes, dignity had to stand quietly until the world was ready to listen. The weight of silence hung heavy in the bank, but for Sergeant Major Robert Hayes, it was nothing compared to the silence of a battlefield after the gunfire faded. As he stood there, check in hand, the murmur of customers and the stern presence of FBI agents began to blur. His mind, unwillingly, almost instinctively, drifted back decades. It was the desert first. The endless heat of Iraq, the smell of sand mixed with burning fuel. He could still hear the frantic radio calls, the screams of engines straining, and the crack of rifles echoing through the night. He had been there, leading a convoy through the streets of Fallujah, a mission that history books would summarize in a line but that lived in his heart like a wound that never closed. That day, his unit was ambushed. Trapped between rooftops alive with gunfire and alleyways rigged with explosives, they were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of hope. Young soldiers barely out of high school looked to him with wide, terrified eyes. They were kids. Kids who should have been home, sitting on porches, dreaming about tomorrow, not kneeling in dust, waiting for death. But Hayes had been there before. Vietnam had taught him the cruelty of war, Afghanistan had taught him its repetition, and Iraq had shown him the cost of forgetting those lessons. In that moment, there was no room for hesitation. He remembered the words he had shouted, words that weren't recorded anywhere but burned into memory. Stay low. Watch my signal. We don't die here today. Then he moved, fast, deliberate, fearless. Hayes took the point, exposing himself to draw fire, giving his men the seconds they needed to break free from the kill zone. Bullets snapped past him, grenades shook the earth, but his focus never wavered. He knew that leadership wasn't about giving orders. It was about taking the first step when no one else dared. 3 soldiers were pinned down behind a disabled Humvee, their cries carried over the chaos. Hayes sprinted, dove, and dragged each one out, his body shielding theirs from fire. A fragment tore across his arm, another seared his leg, but he refused to stop. Blood could wait, lives could not. By the time reinforcements arrived, Hayes had saved nearly 24 men. Young Americans who lived because one old soldier had refused to surrender. For that day, he was awarded the Silver Star. But medals didn't matter to Hayes. What haunted him were the names of the ones he couldn't save. The soldier whose hand slipped from his grip in the smoke. The medic who stayed behind too long. The boy who had written home the night before, saying he couldn't wait to see his little sister again. They were gone. Hayes carried them in silence. And though newspapers printed his name, and commanders praised his battlefield courage, Hayes never saw himself as a hero. Heroes, in his eyes, were the ones buried beneath the flag. As Agent Collins stood before him in the bank, memories like these flooded back. Collins himself had served, before trading the uniform for a suit and badge. He had read reports, studied cases, and once sat in a briefing where Sergeant Major Hayes's name was spoken with reverence. Collins remembered it well. A senior officer had said, "If you ever want to know what leadership under fire looks like, study Hayes." And here he was, standing quietly in a small-town bank, accused of check fraud by someone who couldn't see beyond his age and worn jacket. Collins's chest tightened. This wasn't just a military tribute moment. This was personal. Meanwhile, in the present, the customers in the bank began to whisper the stories they had heard. An old man near the back muttered, "I think I read about him once, convoy rescue, back in '04. A younger man, his baseball cap pulled low, asked, "Why doesn't anyone know about him? Why isn't he famous?" The answer was simple, because Hayes never sought fame. He wasn't the type to stand in front of cameras or write books about himself. He was one of those unsung heroes, men who carried the scars quietly, who believed their duty ended when they stepped off the battlefield. Forgotten heroes, not because they didn't earn remembrance, but because they chose humility over recognition. And yet, men like him shaped history. Hayes's thoughts wandered again, further back this time, to Afghanistan. Kandahar, 2002. A night operation where darkness was supposed to protect them but betrayed them instead. His platoon was cornered, their radios jammed, their ammunition dwindling. He had watched as fear crept across the faces of young soldiers. He had seen how silence can kill faster than bullets, because silence meant doubt. So he had done something unexpected. He stood, exposed, and began to shout. Not orders, not commands, but words of encouragement. Words about brotherhood, about how soldier sacrifice meant never leaving a man behind. He reminded them that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to keep moving forward despite it. And his men did. They fought through the night, breaking through the enemy line. They survived because Hayes refused to let fear decide their fate. Those who returned home told the story not of their own courage, but of the man who gave them the strength to find it. Back in the bank, Hayes's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from memory. His chest tightened, not because of the teller's insult, but because of the faces that still lived inside him. The check he carried wasn't just paper. It was a reminder that his life had been spent in service, that every dollar represented nights without sleep, wounds that never healed, and friendships that ended in silence. Agent Collins knew this. He knew the man before him wasn't just a veteran cashing a pension. He was the embodiment of sacrifice, of honor, of stories untold. And so Collins turned to the room, raising his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, you stand in the presence of one of this nation's real war heroes. A man whose battlefield courage saved lives, whose soldier sacrifice is the reason young Americans came home to their families. Don't forget his name. Don't forget men like him. Because when we do, we forget ourselves." The bank fell utterly silent. Even the teller, who had moments ago pointed at Hayes with disdain, now stared at him with wide eyes. Her arrogance melted into guilt. She had mocked a man who had given her the freedom to live her life without fear. For Hayes, the recognition wasn't needed. But in that moment, in that small bank on an ordinary afternoon, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Not fame, not pride, but a reminder that sacrifice had meaning, and that somewhere, someone still remembered. The bank lobby remained still, as if the very air held its breath. The customers, the staff, even the hum of the ceiling fans seemed quieter after Agent Collins's words. It was the kind of silence that didn't come from fear, but from reverence. The teller, the young woman who had first accused Hayes of fraud, stood frozen. Her hand still hovered near the drawer, her mouth slightly open. But her eyes told the truth. Fear had given way to guilt. Shame pressed down on her shoulders heavier than any authority. Hayes did not look at her. Not yet. His eyes scanned the room, seeing the faces of strangers who now looked at him differently. Just minutes before, he had been judged, mocked, even. Now, those same eyes carried respect. But Hayes didn't bask in it. He had lived long enough to know that respect earned in a moment could fade by tomorrow. What mattered wasn't admiration, it was remembrance. Agent Collins turned to the teller. His voice was clipped, sharp. "You owe this man an apology." The teller swallowed hard, her throat tight. I didn't know. I just thought." "You thought wrong," Collins cut in firmly. "You saw an old man with a worn jacket and assumed fraud. You didn't see the veteran who carried scars for this country. You didn't see the sacrifice behind that check. That's the problem. We've forgotten how to look deeper." Her face flushed red. The customers stared, some with judgment, others with quiet disappointment. She opened her mouth again but found no words that could undo what had been said. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she turned toward Hayes. "Sir," she whispered. I'm sorry." Finally, Hayes's eyes met hers. But instead of anger, instead of triumph, his gaze held something far heavier, disappointment tempered by compassion. His voice was steady, low, but it carried through the bank. "You don't need to know my story," he said softly. "But you do need to know respect. Not for me. For anyone who comes through that door. Every person carries a history you don't see. Some of them carry scars you'll never understand." The teller blinked, her eyes watering. She nodded faintly, unable to answer. For the customers, the scene had shifted from confrontation to something deeper. They weren't just watching a bank dispute anymore. They were witnessing a lesson, a reminder of how easily dignity can be stripped away, and how powerful it is to restore it. Near the back of the line, a young father held his son's hand. The boy tugged at his sleeve. "Dad, who is he? Why are they treating him like that?" The father leaned down, his voice hushed. "That man is a soldier. He fought so people like us could live free. You remember that?" The boy nodded slowly, his wide eyes fixed on Hayes. It was in moments like these that Hayes's quiet impact reached further than the battlefield. He had never written books, never stood on podiums, never demanded the spotlight. But here he was, teaching the next generation without even trying. Collins motioned to his agents, signaling that their presence was no longer needed. Slowly, the black-suited men lowered their guard. They weren't here to arrest anyone. They were here to honor someone who deserved far more than a pension check. Before leaving, Collins turned once more to Hayes. "Sir, I hope you know you're not forgotten. Not by all of us." Hayes gave a faint nod. His words were simple, but heavy with meaning. As long as the names of the fallen aren't forgotten, that's all that matters. The words hung in the air like a prayer. Because Hayes knew the truth. He wasn't carrying just his own story. He carried the memory of men who never came home, of friends who never grew old, of brothers who lived only in photographs tucked away in drawers. His survival was both a blessing and a burden. Every salute he received, he felt belonged to them. The crowd in the bank began to shift. Some approached Hayes quietly, shaking his hand, murmuring words like "thank you" and "God bless you." Others simply bowed their heads as they passed, too moved to speak. The elderly woman who had whispered his name earlier now stepped forward, her cane tapping against the tile. Her eyes glistened as she looked at him. "My husband," she said softly, "served under your command. He always said you were the reason he came home. He passed last year, but he never stopped talking about you." Hayes's throat tightened. He reached out, gently holding her hand. "Then he was the hero," he said quietly. "I only made sure he had the chance to prove it." Tears welled in her eyes as she squeezed his hand. "You gave me decades with him. You'll never know what that meant." The room fell silent again. This was no longer just a bank. It was a place of tribute, an unexpected memorial where one man's forgotten courage became visible to all. And yet, even as gratitude filled the air, Hayes's heart carried the weight of absence. For every handshake, there was a name he remembered that would never shake his hand again. For every thank you, there was a face he saw in the dark, a friend who had given everything. That was the cost of survival, the burden of memory. Forgotten heroes lived on only if men like him kept telling their stories, even when no one asked. But Hayes rarely spoke about the war. Not because he was ashamed, but because he knew civilians couldn't always understand. The blood, the fear, the sacrifice, it wasn't something you wrapped into casual conversation. It was something you carried in silence. Until moments like this, when silence broke and truth demanded to be heard. As the FBI agents prepared to leave, Collins turned back once more. "Sir, I'd like to keep in touch. Men like you, your stories need to be remembered." Hayes gave a tired smile. "It's not my story that matters. It's theirs. The ones who never came home. If you want to honor me, honor them." Collins nodded firmly. "Yes, sir. Always." The agents left, but the memory of their presence lingered. The customers in the bank didn't return to normal chatter right away. Instead, they whispered Hayes's name, spoke about what they had seen, and carried a new respect that hadn't been there before. For the teller, the moment was life-changing. She had judged a man by his appearance, by her own prejudice. And in doing so, she had nearly dishonored someone who had carried the weight of freedom on his shoulders. She would remember this day for the rest of her life, not because of shame, but because of the lesson. And for Hayes, it was just another reminder of what it meant to be an unsung hero. Recognition came and went, but sacrifice was permanent. He didn't need applause. He didn't need headlines. What he needed, what he prayed for, was that the stories of the fallen would live on. As Hayes finally stepped away from the counter, pension check in hand, a hush followed him. Not the hush of suspicion, but the hush of respect. Men and women who had once stared at him with doubt now moved aside, giving him the silent passage of honor. And in that quiet, Hayes walked with the same steady dignity he had carried through every battlefield. Because for him, this wasn't about one afternoon in a bank. It was about a lifetime of service, a lifetime of sacrifice, and the eternal duty of remembering the forgotten heroes who had given everything. The glass doors of the bank slid open, and a wave of warm air swept across Sergeant Major Robert Hayes's face. The world outside looked unchanged. Cars moved down the street. People hurried past with bags of groceries. The sun dipped low behind storefronts. But for those inside the bank, everything had shifted. Hayes stepped out slowly, his pension check tucked carefully into his jacket pocket. He wasn't smiling, not exactly, but his posture carried a quiet pride. Not pride in himself, but in something deeper. In survival. In legacy. In the knowledge that, even in a small way, his story had reminded others of the real war heroes who deserved remembrance. Behind him, the customers who had once whispered suspicion now watched through the glass doors, their expressions softened. Some even raised their hands slightly, as though to salute, though Hayes didn't see it. He wasn't looking for admiration. He was simply walking forward, as he always had. The street outside was busy, but Hayes moved at his own steady pace. His limp, a gift from a long-ago battle, was subtle but constant. Every step carried echoes of the past, sand under his boots, mud clinging to his legs, the heavy weight of brothers leaning on him as they staggered back to safety. He reached the corner and paused. Across the street, a small park stretched out, its flagpole rising tall, the stars and stripes swaying gently in the wind. Hayes's eyes lingered there, his chest tightening as memories surged. He saw faces, not the strangers around him, but the men he had lost. They were young again in his mind, laughing, teasing each other, carrying their rifles with the careless swagger of boys too brave to know they could die. Their voices echoed faintly, ghosts of friendships that time could never erase. He whispered their names under his breath, a roll call no one else could hear. To others, it was just the murmur of an old man. But to him, it was sacred. Each name was a life cut short, a sacrifice that still demanded to be honored. A memory pressed hardest, the convoy in Fallujah. The screams, the smoke, the chaos. He had pulled so many to safety, but not all. And it was those he couldn't save who lived most vividly in his mind. Survivor's guilt, they called it. But Hayes didn't see it that way. To him, it was a responsibility. He had survived so their stories could be told. His life was a living memorial, and every breath he took was in their honor. He stood straighter, staring at the flag. His lips moved again, this time whispering a promise. You're not forgotten. Not while I live. Just then, a voice pulled him back to the present. Sir. Hayes turned. It was the young boy from inside the bank, the one who had asked his father who Hayes was. The child held his father's hand tightly, but his eyes were fixed on Hayes with a mixture of curiosity and awe. Were you really a soldier? The boy asked. Hayes knelt slightly, lowering himself to the boy's eye level. His old knees groaned, but he ignored them. He looked the boy straight in the eyes, his voice steady. I was, he said simply. Did you fight bad guys? The boy asked. Hayes smiled faintly. I fought for the man next to me. For the soldier who needed me. For the people back home who never even knew my name. The boy's brow furrowed, as if trying to understand something too big for his age. Were you scared? Hayes's eyes softened. Every day. But courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what you have to do, even when you are. The boy nodded slowly, as though those words were carving themselves into him. His father placed a hand on his shoulder, his eyes meeting Hayes's with unspoken gratitude. Thank you, the man said quietly, for everything. Hayes gave a small nod. Just remember the ones who never came home. They're the real heroes. And with that, he rose, adjusted his cap, and continued down the sidewalk. The city bustled on, unaware of the moment that had just passed. But for those who had seen it, for the teller, for the customers, for the boy, life would never be quite the same. They had witnessed not just a man, but a legacy. A walking reminder of sacrifice, humility, and courage. Hayes eventually reached a small diner on the corner, one he visited often. The waitress greeted him warmly, pouring his usual cup of coffee without asking. She didn't know what had happened at the bank. She didn't know that 4 FBI cars had stormed in, or that an entire room had been silenced by his name. To her, he was just Mr. Hayes, the polite, quiet regular who always tipped generously. And Hayes preferred it that way. Recognition was fleeting, but quiet dignity, that was eternal. As he sipped his coffee, his eyes drifted again to the flag outside the window. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red. For Hayes, it looked like the battlefield skies he had known. The sunsets he had watched after long, brutal days, when the world still spun despite the chaos of war. He thought of his brothers again, those who hadn't lived to see old age, those who would never sit in diners or cash pension checks. And once more, he whispered their names. Because to forget them would be to lose them all over again. Back at the bank, the teller sat alone in the break room, her hands trembling. She replayed the moment over and over, the accusation, the shame, the revelation. She knew she would never see veterans the same way again. From that day forward, every wrinkled jacket, every faded patch, every quiet man who walked through the doors would remind her of Hayes and of her mistake. Sometimes, it takes a single moment to change how we see the world. For her, this was that moment. As the night settled in, Hayes rose from the diner, left a few bills on the counter, and stepped back into the cooling air. The streets were calmer now, shadows stretching long across the pavement. He adjusted his cap, squared his shoulders, and walked on, carrying with him not just the weight of his years, but the stories of men who would never grow old. For Sergeant Major Robert Hayes, every day was a tribute. Every step was in honor of the fallen. Every quiet act was for the forgotten heroes who had given their last full measure of devotion. And though the world might sometimes mistake him for just another old man, those who truly looked, those who listened, would see something more. A real war hero. A guardian of memory. A living testament to sacrifice.